Hello and welcome. I'm Rubina Margosian. I'm the managing editor of EVN Report, and today we'll be speaking with Timothy Jemal. He's the president of Global Arm, and the subject of our discussion that we set up this podcast about is the Preventing Escalation and Advancing Caucasus Engagement Act, the Peace Act that's being discussed today. But before we start with the Peace Act and what it means and what the criticism is all about or what the Act aims to achieve, let's start with Global Arm, please. Timothy, can you explain a little bit about Global Arm and what the organization aims to do? Because the bill and your organization are closely knit together because you're supporting the Act.
That's correct. Well, Rubina, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to speak with you today or this evening or this morning, wherever you are, where she and I are. So we started Global Arm in 2022. It is a US-based nonprofit organization focused on lobbying, initially in the United States, and our goal is eventually to take this model to other parts of the world so that we can strengthen the pro-Armenia, pro-Artsakh voice. The main reason we started Global Arm is because there was a real void in Washington, D.C., having a successful pro-Armenia, pro-Artsakh lobbying entity. What we saw, unfortunately, and many of the diasporans around the world saw, in 2020, the Artsakh War was, of course, a disaster for Armenians, for Artsakhs, for Armenia, for a generation of men and women who lost their lives as a result of Azerbaijani aggression with the help of Turkey, Pakistan, jihadists recruited from Syria and Turkey. We know what happened. But what we saw, Rubina, was that our political forces, our political advocacy was also weak. We were not only overwhelmed on the battlefield, we were overwhelmed politically, we were overwhelmed in the media. And so it was very disturbing to me and others who saw this happening because, of course, during the war, we did everything we could to try to help the people of Artsakh, what was happening to them. And everyone, I went on marches, several of them. I'm sure you did as well. Many of diasporans around the world did. But my background is in political advocacy and lobbying. I've been doing this for 35 years. And in the 1990s, I was the chief lobbyist for a group called the Armenian Assembly. And I actually was the person who escorted Congressman Frank Pallone, who's the co-chairman of the Congressional Armenian Caucus, which he and I actually started together. I escorted Frank Pallone to Stepanakert in 1997 on his very first trip to Armenia and to Artsakh, where he delivered a speech in Parliament, then the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, recognizing its independence. And during that period of time, I mean, it was a very emotional moment, incredible moment. Actually, even before we drove on the road from Armenia to Stepanakert, and it was before the All Armenia Fund road, so that was even more adventurous for us. But the most important point was being there. And at that time, the level of Armenian lobbying in terms of successes, and what I mean by successes, are policies changing. Is Congress enacting legislation that's getting signed into law by the President of the United States? And that's yes, it was happening. What we saw in right after the Artsakh War was a period of unsuccessful Armenian lobbying for about 25 years in Washington, D.C. What we saw was U.S. assistance to Armenia precipitously declining from about 2000 to the 2022-ish, deep decline in U.S. assistance to Armenia. We saw the Section 9, you hear a lot about Section 907 sanctions, and let me explain that, because I've been on the front lines of defending Section 907 for many years in Washington, D.C., fending off multiple attacks by the Azeri lobbyists, the paid lobbyists for Azerbaijan, trying to weaken those sanctions. So those sanctions that were put in place in 1992, and we consistently saved them from attempts by Azerbaijani lobbyists to repeal them. What those sanctions did, they prohibit the United States government from providing assistance directly to the government of Azerbaijan. That's what Section 907 is in its basic form. And it says that those sanctions shall be in place until Azerbaijan lifts its blockades and offensive uses of military force against Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. In 2001, Rabina, those sanctions were lifted. And for over nearly 25 years, they were not in place. The Armenian lobby, unfortunately, was not strong enough to maintain those sanctions. So in 2018 and 2019, the US government provided $100 million in military aid to Azerbaijan right before the war in Artsakh in 2020. And then, so what we saw was a very weakened state of Armenian lobbying in Washington, D.C. And those of us like myself who are pro-Armenia and we're pro-Artsakh, we're not pro any government. I looked at the talents that I had and the skills that I had there in political advocacy, and we decided we needed a new force, a new lobbying entity with a different model. We are diasporans who run Global Arm, but what we did, Rubina, is we hired two professional lobbying firms, non-Armenian professional lobbying firms in Washington, D.C., one for Republicans and one for Democrats to represent us in Washington. In less than 3 years, and we'll talk about it, we've made an incredible difference in my view, and it's been very successful in a period when it was easy to get discouraged, put your head in the sand and say, I don't want to do anything. There's nothing we can do. There is something we can do if we pull together.
And of course, it's part of resilience. It's part of Armenia's capacity to put up with any situation of crisis, with any crisis. And the more the merrier sometimes, because with situations not necessarily in a way aligned, because the Azerbaijani propaganda machine and the lobbying machine is as big as the discrepancy between our armies also at this point. So if we have to build up, we have to start building up right now.
No question, Rabina, in that you mentioned the Azerbaijani lobbying machine. So at the time after 2000, for almost over 20 years, they were building up their lobbying army,
Yes.
their public relation army, their bots. We saw that play out during the 2020 war. We were overwhelmed with false narratives, lies, but that was accumulation effect over 20 years during this buildup of their political influence and their propaganda, not only in Washington, around the world. We didn't keep up. We did not keep up with the lobbying force that they had. We were nowhere, as you do a podcast, we were nowhere in terms of media and public relations and talking about the narrative of Artsakh deserving to be independent and to pursue their self-determination. We were so far behind that the result on the battlefield we know, but in diplomacy and lobbying and in public relations, we fell so far behind.
And really, truly, there's no excuse for this, because not even financially, that's not the excuse for falling this far behind. Are we catching up?
Well,
Are we bridging the gap there anytime soon?
absolutely. We are catching up. When we formed Global Arm in 2022, as I mentioned, we hired these two firms. We've been a cornerstone at changing the narrative in Washington, D.C. Before, Armenia was perceived as the aggressor. Armenians, I should say, Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, they were perceived as the aggressor. Armenia is perceived as a satellite or shadow of Russia. And Armenia was never thought of in American terms as being in a strategic interest of the United States. That narrative started to really change in 2023 when Global Arm, we made contact with Luis Moreno Ocampo, the founding prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And Mr. Ocampo, as you know, came out and declared there was genocide taking place in Artsakh because of the over 10-month blockade of the Lachin corridor by Baku or by Aliyev by Azerbaijan. By the way, that blockade was deemed illegal by the International Court of Justice, the UN's court. So Mr. Ocampo came out and said there's genocide. We connected, Global Arm, we connected with Mr. Ocampo. We immediately took him to Washington, D.C., and had him meet with key senators, staff, House members. We secured him a spot to testify in the House of Representatives. And then the narrative really began to change.
But also the narrative can change sometimes when there's actual change on the ground, and to what extent the actual change in Armenia, stepping away from Russia,
Of course.
and Western pivot helped change the narrative, because there could have been a situation where changing the narrative would have been almost an impossible task if it wasn't also supported by facts on the ground.
So there's no question, Rabina, look, we're in Washington, D.C. One of the things that makes you effective in Washington is as a lobbyist. And I think the listeners need to understand this. It's something I've been doing for 35 years. You have to have, one, you have to have credibility. Who are you as a lobbyist or lobbying entity? You have to have good lobbyists, people that are good at their jobs. They're really good at lobbying. And then because we're in the capital of the United States, you have to lobby on issues that are in the interest of the United States. And we all want to believe that there's a humanitarian thread to every person and every policymaker and every member of Congress and every administration, that they're going to do the right thing. They're going to recognize the Armenian genocide of 1915. They're going to declare genocide in Artsakh. That's not the case. You have to align it, unfortunately, you have to align it with the interests of the United States. And you're right, the Western pivot, the trying to emerge from the shadows of Russia, obviously helped change the narrative and our agenda. So when we formed, you asked me, Rubini, at the beginning, when we formed Global Arm, we made it very simple. Yes, we're a lobbying entity, but we only have three goals: strengthen U.S.-Armenia security relations, strengthen U.S.-Armenia economic ties, and seek justice for Armenians who've been victimized by Azerbaijani aggression. Those are our only three objectives. And we pursue them sometimes collectively, sometimes separately. Lobbying requires finesse, strategy, and persistence, and you have to have all three, and you have to have access to people who have decisions. So when you walk into their office, you have credibility with them.
Yes, of course. And coming to back to the bill, because that kind of like was the reason why we're having this
Sure.
conversation. Um, there's a lot of criticism about it, but also coming back to what you just said, and also referring to one of the recent security reports that EVN published by Dr. Narses Kopalian, explaining why the Washington Accords happened altogether, because Washington changed strategy, said this is U.S. interests and there will be repercussions, and there's a deadline for Azerbaijan to agree. Is this bill also in line with that logic, where saying there will be sanctions? And is this bill also, more than anything else, whether it's implemented or not, or whether it passes or not, sends the message that one of the parties to the initialing of the peace agreement or the Washington Accords is not as trusted as the other one?
Yes, of course. Let me explain. But before I do that, you mentioned there's a lot of criticism to the bill. Yeah. I saw Aliyev's propaganda machine doesn't like the bill. I've saw the articles come from Baku. We expected that from Baku. What is it? Caliber, some of these, pro-Aliyev, Aliyev controlled media outlets in Baku, they don't like it. I expected that, and we expected that. If there are forces that are Armenians
That's
who are
not
aligned,
even criticism, that's pure objection to the
yeah,
bill.
yeah. Well, if there are Armenian entities that are aligning with Aliyev, I would suggest that's not a good place to be. If Aliyev's propaganda machine doesn't like the bill, there's a reason why they don't like the bill, and the reason is the bill is it puts a target on Aliyev's back, on his family's back, on his military units, on the banks in Azerbaijan and foreign banks that help do transactions with the oil and gas industry. So yes, I mean the bill has multiple goals, and we do intend to see the bill through Congress and signed into law. But there's no question that
For those who haven't read the bill, or just read the criticism or the comments on the bill, but not necessarily what the bill represents, can we just go over it, just
yeah,
the
yeah, sure.
provisions, so that it's very clear what we're talking about?
Absolutely. So the bill would, the Peace Act, I think you started
Yes, the act.
uh, the acronym is the Peace Act, which is for Preventing Escalation and Advancing Caucasus Engagement Act, or Peace Act. In Washington, they like to name bills with the acronyms. So it's called the Peace Act, and
Worked
it's
out
sponsored.
nicely.
Indeed, indeed. Um, And it was sponsored by a congressman named Daryl Issa, pro-Armenian, pro-Artsakh member of Congress for many years. He's on the key committee in Congress, Foreign Affairs Committee. So the bill would sanction Azerbaijan's senior government officials, including Aliyev, his immediate family members, his military units, foreign financial institutions, including the Central Bank of Azerbaijan, for engaging in hostile actions against Armenia. I mean, that's the crux of the bill. And that would be triggered, those sanctions are triggered under a US presidential certification that Azerbaijan has engaged in aggression. It is true, it'll be up to the President of the United States to make the decision, has Azerbaijan engaged in aggression? But to your earlier point, this bill, there's only one entity that's targeted in this bill, and that's Azerbaijan. Armenia is not a target in this bill. The target is Azerbaijan, and the reason they are a target is because they repeatedly lied to the United States over and over and over again that they're not going to use aggression against Armenians. And of course, in the August 8th declaration that you also mentioned, the Washington Accords, not the peace agreement, but the Washington Declaration, because they didn't sign a peace agreement, they signed a declaration. And in there, it talks about the inadmissibility of the use of force. And that's in what Aliyev signed. And for the first time I've seen in my lifetime, he's been a dictator for 22 years. He stood up before President Trump and said, I will never use aggression. What are you talking about? Right? Everyone saw that. That will never happen. And so this legislation, just getting back to the bill, for the first time ever, of all the sanctions bills, and there have been very good sanctions bills since Section 907, none of them have been signed into law. This represents the first time a bill, a U.S. congressional bill, would sanction Aliyev's main instrument of aggression. And what's that? The oil and gas industry. What fuels his military aggression, his pursuit of military conquest over not only Artsakh, but also Armenia, his repeated threats and bullying of Armenia. It's his oil and gas sector that propels the military machine. And this will go after that. The bill would also, it would block, property. It would revoke visas of Azerbaijanis. It would make them ineligible for U.S. visas. And it would also target anyone who's on parole or anyone who's aided or abetted or facilitated Azerbaijani aggression against Armenia would be subject to these sanctions. And they would be triggered if the President of the United States determines Azerbaijan has committed aggression. And by the way, aggression includes occupation.
I
Because in
was
the
going to ask you because the act also defines aggression. Because defining aggression is kind of like the Achilles heel of world order. What is aggression in this point, and what is aggression as per this act?
Yeah, there is extensive definitions in the bill. I'd be happy to read with a section of the bill that deals with military aggression, but it includes violations of Armenia's territorial integrity, its independence, its sovereignty, and there's no question occupation is a violation of that. So
Already do have occupation by Azerbaijan. Does the
there
bill
are
repeal the bill retroactively, or like given the situation today on the borders with Azerbaijan?
if the bill is passed into law and Azerbaijan still is occupying Armenia, they will be declared in violation of the act for hostile actions and aggression. Because the bill is very clear that Armenia's sovereignty and territorial integrity is to be protected and ensured, or else the sanctions will be triggered.
The act also has this the protection of humanitarian channels, which I found interesting, and I wanted to ask about it because does it also, in a way, predict aggression, and that's there to protect humanitarian channels because it also kind of refers to agriculture and humanitarian aid and medicine.
So,
What
so
was
that's So a lot of the sanctions bills, even the Section 907 sanctions, always had what's called an exception for humanitarian aid. So in the event there is a need to provide humanitarian aid, let's say, for example, there's an earthquake and there are sanctions in place against Ilham Aliyev and his family, that if there was an earthquake, say, for example, in Azerbaijan, and there needed to be truly humanitarian aid delivered, that would be a carve out in the bill if that were to occur. I think that's the reason why there are humanitarian exceptions in the bill.
So some of the criticism that I've read about is basically saying this is a paper tiger, and if there were to be sanctions imposed upon Azerbaijan, it could have been done by a presidential decree. So we don't need as such an act or a bill to do so. And also, kind of this expectation that the Peace Act would address all and every concerns that Armenia has, and all and every injustice that has happened in the recent years. What's the
Yeah,
response?
well, first of all, I'll address both. I'll address both questions. One, pursuing accountability for Azerbaijan's aggression and sanctioning Ilham Aliyev and his family and his military units is not done at the expense of pursuing the release of Armenian hostages held in Azerbaijan or the right of return for Artsakhs to Nagorno-Karabakh. One is you don't, if you pursue one, it doesn't mean you're against the other. We have, as I mentioned earlier, we were the only group in Washington, D.C. that actually got Armenian victims to testify, not even after Luis Moreno Ocampo. We work with a group called the Center for Truth and Justice. We brought them to Washington, D.C. and insisted they were to testify at a congressional hearing on the ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh. So we made sure that their voices were heard, and they spoke not only the victims, but also the prisoners who are currently held by Baku. Second, Global Arm, we were part of helping introduce legislation just last month that had 4 conditions in it. Azerbaijan must release the Armenian prisoners, must have a right of return for Artsakh ethnically cleansed, must deoccupy Armenia, and they must preserve Armenian religious and cultural heritage. If they don't do any of those things, then Armenia would get increased military assistance from the United States. This is a separate bill. We are pursuing all avenues to seek success and to address the nefarious actions and that Ilham Aliyev has been undertaking as the leader or dictator of Azerbaijan against Armenians. And then thirdly, Rubina, we at Global Arm have been meeting extensively with leadership of the Trump administration, even before they were inaugurated in January. And one of our first recommendation to them, because we met with them early and it was very clear they wanted to forge a stronger relationship with Armenia. We had credibility, and so we've been working very closely with them ever since. And the first thing they told us is they wanted to see the prisoners released. So if you hear anything you hear right now that somehow they just became interested in the issue is not true. They've been interested in the very beginning. And if you go back and look at the very first public statement from the American National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, who's now the UN ambassador, his very first announcement was to Aliyev, release the Armenian prisoners. So we are cornering Aliyev and his lobbyists on every single step that they take, whether it's in the administration, whether it's in Congress, whether it's this bill or that bill. We are ensuring that all of our priorities are addressed. Can every single priority be addressed in one bill? That's challenging to do, but it's absolutely not a paper tiger. I mean, if you think, well, if it was a paper tiger, why would Aliyev's propaganda machine oppose it? Why don't they endorse it? If they think it helps them, why would Ilham Aliyev and his media be against it? I
Well,
mean, because
I
it's
think that sanctions a country and its leadership, and especially its economy, and especially an economy based on oil, naturally
yeah. So
will.
it's not a paper tiger, it's real. They should fear it. I've said this, I already said this before. Ilham Aliyev has a decision to make. Get out of Armenia, release the prisoners, stop destroying Armenian churches, and move forward on a right of return for the people ethnically cleansed. It's in his hands. This bill is a target on his back. It's on the back of his main instrument of aggression. And Rabina, pursuit of this bill is not at the expense of the releasing the political prisoners, the Armenian prisoners in Baku. It's very much part of it's a multifaceted strategy that we're pursuing in Washington, and it's working. It's working. People are listening, and we're tired of losing. Meaning, we at Global Arm, the diaspora, we're tired of losing, being on the losing end, putting our heads in the sand, saying we can't do anything. We don't need to score points on social media. I can publish something on social media. You can, and there's a lot of things that I want to see. Aliyev should be brought to justice before a court, whether it's the ICC or whether it's universal jurisdiction somewhere. He's a war criminal. I know that. But we're working in Washington, D.C., and we're trying to corner them and their lobbyists so that they can't get out.
Yes, and yeah, so many war criminals today in today's world that need to be brought to justice, and
Of
that
course.
road ahead, and maybe just peace on earth should be established before that happens. Thank you
But
very
we're not.
much. But
Yeah.
one last question,
Yeah.
very quick one, because we're also running out of time. What are the main obstacles that you see on the road, on the way of passing the bill, and when you expect it to be, you know?
Well, so some of it's procedural. Passing a bill is not that is challenging in Washington. Not that many bills become law. And right now, also the government is shut down. So Congress really isn't working at the moment. And so it makes it challenging. There's not much time left in this session. So that's one challenge. I believe that there is unanimity in Washington that Aliyev is the aggressor, one. Two, that Armenia has emerged as a key strategic ally of the United States. And then three, it's in the U.S. interest to assure that violence is stopped, that aggression is accounted for, and that there are consequences for them. I think we have the momentum on our side to move this bill forward. And I believe, Rabina, that I believe the Trump administration will be supportive of this bill because even though no administration has wanted sanctions on Azerbaijan for 35 years, I believe that in this instance, because of Armenia's emergence as a key ally of the U.S. and because of the U.S. interest in assuring that aggression is stopped and that the way to stop it is not like how Joe Biden did it. Joe Biden said, don't commit aggression. And then Azerbaijan committed aggression. They ethnically cleansed Artsakh. And what were the consequences for Aliyev?
Well, no,
Nothing.
but also at
Nothing.
this point we have the trip road, which
But there were no consequences. So this idea that it's a paper tiger, it wasn't even a paper tiger before. When Biden was in power, they did nothing. Now we'll have something in place. And of course, they have the trip now. Having the trip a functional route through Armenia under Armenia's sovereignty is deemed in the interest of the United States, obviously named after the current president. And I believe there will be a groundbreaking very soon. And I believe the people of Hayastan, the people of Sunik in particular, I think they want this. This is in the interest of both Armenia and the United States.
and this act does say an aggression against Armenia is an aggression against Trip.
Of course. I mean, no question. I mean, you're very astute. One of the the underpinnings of the bill is that there's aggression against Armenia and there's aggression against Trip, and that's against U.S. interests to see that happen. And so there'll be consequences for it.
Thank you very much for your time and for this conversation and for all your efforts. We look forward to seeing the bill pass, the act pass, even though everyone should understand it takes time. It's a process. And just because it's a hot topic of discussion today doesn't mean that it's going to pass tomorrow. Long road ahead. And thank you very much. And I believe we'll be speaking again.
Rabina, thank you for having me.